The official records of the Montana Territory state that on December 25th, 1884, 3 men died in a gunfight at the ridge of Dead Man's Drop. But history is written by the victors, and the truth was buried under 6 feet of snow. What you are about to hear isn't just a story. It is the contents of a private journal belonging to a man named Silas Thorne, found under the floorboards of a demolished cabin in 1992. It is the story of a man who intended to end his life, and the woman who crawled onto his porch to save it. This is the legend of the Christmas miracle of Bitterroot Ridge. The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed. It was the kind of sound that stripped the soul bare, a relentless, high-pitched shriek that tore through the timber of the Bitterroot Mountains. Silas Thorne sat in the center of his cabin, a single kerosene lamp flickering on the rough-hewn table. He was a mountain of a man, 50 years of hard living etched into the deep crevices of his face. His beard was a thicket of iron gray, and his hands that had panned for gold, felled redwoods, and buried a wife and daughter, rested heavily on the table. Between those hands lay a Colt peacemaker. It was Christmas Eve, 1884. For the rest of the world, it was a time of nativity and joy. For Silas, it was the 10th anniversary of the fire that had taken Martha, the fire that had taken little Sarah. Silas looked at the gun. He had been Bear Thorne to the folks down in Iron Creek. A legend. The man who tracked the grizzly that killed the mayor's son. But legends don't keep you warm at night, and legends don't silence the voices in your head. He had decided, weeks ago, that he wouldn't see the sunrise of 1885. The isolation was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb. He checked the cylinder. 1 round. That was all he needed. "Merry Christmas, Silas," he whispered to the empty room. The cabin groaned under the weight of the snow piling against the north wall. He lifted the steel to his temple. The metal was cold, a biting contrast to the feverish heat of his despair. He closed his eyes, summoning the image of Sarah's face, her laugh, the way she used to chase fireflies in the tall grass of the valley. Thump. Silas froze. His finger hovered over the trigger. Thump. Scratch. It wasn't the wind. The wind didn't have rhythm. This was a dull, heavy sound against the bottom of the door. A wolf? A desperate cougar? Silas lowered the gun, his survival instinct overriding his death wish. He stood up, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He grabbed the lantern in his left hand, the Colt in his right. He moved to the door, listening. A low, pathetic sound filtered through the thick oak. A whimper, not an animal, human. Silas threw the latch and shoved the door open. The blizzard instantly invaded the room, a swirling vortex of ice and white. He looked out, squinting against the gale. At first, he saw nothing but the drift. Then he looked down. She was a heap of rags, half buried in the snow. Her skin was blue, her lips cracked and bleeding. She wore a coat that was 3 sizes too big, tattered at the hems, and her boots were held together with twine. She couldn't have been more than 25. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy, skirting the edge of death. She tried to speak, but her jaw was frozen rigid. She simply reached out a hand that looked like a claw, wrapped in bloody bandages. Silas didn't think. He dropped the gun. He dropped the lantern. He scooped her up in his massive arms. She weighed nothing, less than a sack of flour. She was ice cold, a corpse that hadn't stopped moving yet. He kicked the door shut with his heel, shutting out the storm. He carried her to the hearth, where the embers were dying. He laid her on the bearskin rug and frantically began stoking the fire, throwing log after log until the flames roared. He turned back to her. She wasn't moving. "No, no, no," Silas grunted, his voice rusty from disuse. "You don't die on my floor, not tonight." He began to chafe her hands, rubbing life back into the frozen limbs. He stripped the wet, frozen rags off her. Underneath the oversized coat, she was wearing a dress made of fine blue silk, filthy, torn, and stained with mud, but silk nonetheless. It was a dress that belonged in a ballroom in Boston, not a blizzard in Montana. As he pulled the wet fabric away, something fell from her pocket. A heavy, leather-bound ledger. It hit the floor with a solid thud. Silas ignored it. He grabbed his wool blankets, wrapping her tight, cocooning her against the heat of the fire. He boiled water. He poured a drop of whiskey between her blue lips. For hours, he worked on her. He watched the color slowly, painfully return to her cheeks. He listened as her breathing shifted from a ragged rattle to a steady rhythm. It was nearly dawn when she finally opened her eyes. They were green, startlingly, vividly green. Like the pines in summer, she looked at the ceiling, then at the fire, and finally, her gaze landed on Silas, who was sitting in the rocking chair, the Colt back in his holster, watching her. She flinched, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Terror, raw and primal, flooded her face. "Easy," Silas rumbled. He tried to soften his voice, but it came out like gravel. "You're safe. You're at the Thorn cabin. High Ridge." She stared at him, her teeth chattering slightly. Who are you?" "Name's Silas," he said. "You nearly died on my porch, miss." She looked around the room, her eyes darting to the windows, then to the door. Did anyone follow me?" "Not in this storm," Silas said. "Even the devil stays home in weather like this." "Who are you running from?" She didn't answer. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear leaking out. "I thought I was dead. I prayed to God to just let me sleep." Silas leaned forward. The gun he had held to his head hours ago felt heavy on his hip. He looked at this woman, this broken, frozen thing that had interrupted his suicide. "You arrived in rags on Christmas Eve," Silas said softly, a strange realization washing over him. He gestured to the gun he had left on the table, then back to her. "I was waiting for something tonight. I didn't know what. But you stopped me from doing something I couldn't undo." She looked at him, confused. "You're the miracle I waited for," he said, his voice cracking. It wasn't romantic. It was an admission of brokenness. He saw her not as a lover, but as a divine intervention. She stared at him, and then, slowly, she reached a hand out from the blanket. "My name is Margaret," she whispered, "but the men chasing me, they call me the thief." Silas looked at the leather ledger on the floor. "And what did you steal, Margaret?" "I didn't steal money," she hissed, a sudden fire in her eyes. "I stole the truth." Christmas Day broke with a blinding brilliance. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of pristine white powder. The sun shattered off the snow, creating a glare that could blind a man if he wasn't careful. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of chicory coffee and frying bacon. Silas moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size. He wasn't used to cooking for 2. Not since Sarah. Margaret, Maggie, as she asked to be called, sat up on the rug, wrapped in Silas's spare flannel shirt. It swallowed her whole. She was eating the bacon as if she hadn't seen food in a week, which, Silas suspected she hadn't. Now that the shadow of death had receded, Silas could see her clearly. She was beautiful, in a sharp, aristocrat way, but hard. Her hands were calloused, not from labor, but from gripping reins, or perhaps a gun. There was a bruise blooming on her jawline, turning a sickly purple. "You got a name for the man who gave you that?" Silas asked, nodding to her jaw while pouring coffee into a tin cup. Maggie froze, the bacon halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly. "His name is Thaddeus Rourke." The coffee pot clattered onto the stove. Silas turned slowly. The name hung in the air like smoke. "Rourke?" Silas repeated. "Pinkerton?" "Ex-Pinkerton," Maggie corrected. "Now he works for the Copper Kings, specifically for Senator Cornelius Vance." Silas whistled low. "You aim high, girl. Vance owns half the territory. Rourke is his dog, a dog that bites hard." "I know," Maggie said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "I was married to the senator's son, Edward." Silas sat down opposite her. "Was?" "Edward is dead," she said flatly. "An accident in the mines 2 months ago. That's what they told the papers. That's what they told me." She reached for the leather ledger lying on the floor and pulled it into her lap. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped it. "Edward was a good man," she continued. "He was soft, maybe, but good. He found out what his father was doing. It wasn't just mining copper, Silas. They were diverting water from the reservations, starving out the locals to force them to sell land for pennies. Then when the families wouldn't leave, accidents happened. Fires. Shootings." Silas's eyes darkened. He knew about fires. "Edward kept records," Maggie said. "He wrote it all down. Every bribe, every order for a burning, every sheriff paid off. He was going to take it to the U.S. Marshals in Helena. The night before he was set to leave, there was a cave-in at the mine he was inspecting. They said it was tragic." She opened the book. It was filled with tight, frantic handwriting. "I found this in his desk," she whispered. "Rourke came for it the day after the funeral. He tore the house apart. I ran. I'd been running for 3 weeks. I took a train to Missoula, then a horse, but the horse threw me when the storm started." Silas looked at the woman. She was a widow, a fugitive, and holding the most dangerous object in Montana. "Rourke doesn't give up," Silas said. "I knew him in Abilene 10 years back. He's a tracker. He enjoys the hunt more than the pay." "I know he's coming," Maggie said. She looked Silas dead in the eye. "I know I'm a stranger to you. I know I'm trouble. But you said I was a miracle. You said I saved you." Silas rubbed his face. He felt the ghost of the gun against his temple again. He looked at the empty chair where his daughter used to sit. He had spent 10 years mourning, hiding from the world, convinced that justice was a lie and God had abandoned the mountains. And now, here was this woman, bringing a war to his doorstep, a righteous war. "Why did you come up here?" Silas asked. "This isn't on the way to Helena." "I heard stories," Maggie said, "in the saloon in Iron Creek, before I stole the horse. Old-timers talking about a man called Bear, who lived up in the clouds. They said you were the only law the mountains respected. They said you were the man the sheriff was afraid of." Silas snorted. "I ain't the law. I'm just a tired old man." "You're alive," Maggie said fiercely. "And because of you, I'm alive. That has to mean something." Silas stood up and walked to the window. He scraped the frost off the glass. Down in the valley, miles away, he could see a thin trail of black smoke rising against the white snow. A campfire, or a signal. "He's down there," Silas said. Iron Creek is 10 miles down. If Rourke is there, he's waiting for the snow to pack down so horses can move. What do we do? Maggie asked. Silas turned back to her. The despair that had clouded his eyes for a decade was gone. In its place was a cold, hard glimmer. It was the look of a man who finally had a purpose. We don't run, Silas said. Running kills you in this snow. If Rourke wants the book, he has to come up here to get it. He walked over to the wall and pulled a Winchester rifle from the rack. He tossed a box of shells onto the table. Do you know how to shoot, Maggie? I can shoot a rabbit at 50 yards, she said. Good. Silas cranked the lever of the rifle. Because Rourke ain't a rabbit. He's a wolf, and he's bringing the pack. But Silas had a secret of his own. He wasn't just protecting her because it was the right thing to do. As he watched Maggie trace the spine of that ledger, he saw the resemblance. The fierce jaw, the green eyes. He hadn't told her yet. He couldn't. Not now. But he knew her father. Her real father. Not the man who raised her in Boston, but the man who had passed through these mountains 25 years ago and left a baby girl on a church doorstep because he was too wild to raise her. Silas knew because that man had been his brother, Elias. Maggie wasn't just a stranger. She was blood. Get dressed, Silas commanded, throwing her a pair of his old wool trousers and a heavy sheepskin vest. We have work to do. We need to fortify. By sundown, this cabin is going to be a fortress. And what about the miracle? Maggie asked, pausing. Why did you say that? Really? Silas stopped at the door. He looked at the empty loop of rope hanging by the rafters, the rope he had taken down just before she knocked. Because, Maggie, he said, his voice low. A man needs a reason to die, but he needs a hell of a lot better reason to live. You gave me both. 10 miles down the mountain, the town of Iron Creek was trying to pretend it was Christmas. A few meager strings of dried cranberries hung over the livery stable, and the saloon, the Golden Steer, was packed with miners trying to drink away the memory of the bitter cold. The doors to the saloon didn't swing open. They were kicked open. The music from the out-of-tune piano died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Standing in the doorway was a man in a long black duster coat, the snow melting on his shoulders, looking like oil. He had a face that was too smooth, too pale, like wax left out in the sun. He wore round, smoked spectacles that hid his eyes. Thaddeus Rourke. Behind him, 5 men filed in. They were hard men, mercenaries hired from the dregs of Butte and Helena. They carried Winchesters and wore the distinct lack of expression that comes from killing for a paycheck. Rourke stepped into the room, the spurs on his boots chiming like funeral bells. He walked to the bar. The bartender, a nervous man named Jeb, wiped a glass with a trembling hand. Whiskey, Rourke said. His voice was soft, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. And information. Jeb poured the drink, spilling a little on the wood. It's Christmas, mister. We don't want no trouble. Trouble is already here, Jeb. Rourke smiled, revealing teeth that were perfectly straight. I'm looking for a woman. Blue dress, rags, likely half frozen. She stole a horse from the livery 3 days ago. Lot of folks pass through, a miner shouted from the back, emboldened by liquid courage. Why don't you get back on your horse and... Rourke didn't look back. He simply raised his left hand, and one of his men, a scar-faced brute named Dutch, pistol-whipped the miner before the sentence was finished. The room gasped. The miner slumped to the floor, unconscious. She is carrying property of Senator Vance, Rourke said, sipping his whiskey. She headed up the North Pass. Now, my tracker says the snow covered her tracks at the tree line. Who lives up there? The room was silent. The locals exchanged nervous glances. Sheriff, Rourke said, turning to an older man sitting in the corner with a tin star on his chest. Sheriff Josiah Miller was a good man, but he was old, and his arthritis was worse than his aim. You know the terrain. Who lives past the tree line? Miller stood up slowly, his hand resting near his gun, but not on it. Turn around, Rourke. The pass is closed. If she went up there, she's dead. The drifts are 10 feet deep. I didn't ask for a weather report, Rourke said, his voice dropping an octave. I asked who lives there. Miller sighed, knowing he couldn't protect the secret. Only one man crazy enough to live on the ridge, Silas Thorne. Rourke froze. The glass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Thorne, Rourke whispered. Well, isn't that a divine joke? He turned to his men. Gentlemen, the price has just doubled. Why? Asked Dutch, wiping blood from his pistol. Because, Rourke said, finishing his drink and slamming the glass down, shattering it. Silas Thorne is the man who gave me this limp in Abilene 12 years ago. I thought he was dead. Finding the girl is a job. Killing Thorne? That will be a pleasure. Rourke walked to the center of the room. We ride in 1 hour. We need fresh horses, snowshoes, and dynamite. If anyone in this town tries to send a warning signal, I will burn Iron Creek to the ground and salt the earth. He looked at the sheriff. Do you understand me, Josiah? The sheriff nodded, defeated. He'll kill you, Rourke. You know that. He's a ghost up there. Ghosts don't bleed, Rourke said, adjusting his smoked glasses. But Silas Thorne will. As Rourke stepped back out into the biting cold, he looked up toward the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. The smoke from Silas's cabin was just a faint smudge against the gray sky. Rourke checked his pocket watch. It was 2 p.m. They would reach the cabin by nightfall. He wasn't just coming for the ledger anymore. He was coming to settle a decade-old score. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from rescue to war. Silas moved with a methodical intensity. He had upturned the heavy oak table, pushing it against the door and nailing it into the floorboards. He had taken jars of black powder, leftover from his day's blasting stumps, and was fashioning crude explosives using tin cans and fuses cut from old rope. Maggie was not idle. She had tied her hair back with a strip of leather and was currently melting down lead figures, old toy soldiers that had belonged to Silas's daughter, into bullet molds over the fire. It's sacrilege, she said softly, dropping a lead cavalryman into the ladle, melting toys to kill men. Sarah wouldn't mind, Silas said, not looking up from the shotgun he was sawing down. She hated the soldiers anyway. She liked the horses. Silas paused, looking at Maggie. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating that sharp jawline, those piercing green eyes. The resemblance was becoming unbearable to him. He couldn't send her into a gunfight without her knowing why he was fighting so hard. Maggie, Silas said, put the ladle down. Something in his tone made her stop. She set the lead on the hearth and turned to him. What is it? Do you hear them? No, not yet. Silas walked over to a small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He unlocked it with a key he kept around his neck. Inside were his most precious things: a locket with Sarah's picture, his wife's wedding ring, and an old, faded tintype photograph. He handed the photograph to Maggie. It showed two men, young and wild, standing in front of a mining sluice in California, circa 1859. One was clearly a younger, broader Silas. The other man was leaner, handsome, with a reckless grin, and eyes that seemed to laugh at the camera. "That's you," Maggie said, pointing to the left. "Who is the other one?" "That was my brother," Silas said heavily. "Elias Thorne." Maggie looked closer. She traced the face of the laughing man. Her breath hitched. "Elias was a dreamer," Silas said, his voice rough, "and a gambler. He fell in love with a woman in San Francisco, a rich man's daughter. They ran off together, came east to the territories. But the life, it was too hard for her. She died in childbirth, in a wagon near the Yellowstone River." Maggie's hands were trembling. "My father, the man who raised me in Boston, he told me I was adopted. He said my parents died in a cholera outbreak." "He lied to protect you," Silas said. "Elias was broken after your mother died. He knew he couldn't raise a baby girl on the trail. He was a wanted man by then. Debts, fights. So he left you on the steps of a church in a basket. He pinned a note to your blanket that just said Margaret. That was your mother's name." Silas stepped closer, his massive shadow engulfing her. "Elias came to me a year later. He told me what he did. He cried like a baby. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I'd look out for you. He died 2 weeks later in a bar fight in Deadwood." Maggie looked from the photo to Silas. Tears welled in her green eyes, Elias's eyes. "You're not a stranger, Maggie," Silas whispered. "You're my blood. You're my niece." The silence in the cabin was absolute. The wind outside seemed to stop, as if the mountain itself was listening. Maggie let out a sob, half laugh, half cry. She rushed forward, burying her face in Silas's chest. For the first time in 10 years, Silas hugged someone back. He wrapped his arms around her, closing his eyes. The emptiness that had plagued him for a decade began to fill with a fierce, burning protective instinct. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I felt so alone." "You ain't alone," Silas grunted, pulling back and holding her by the shoulders. "And that's why Thaddeus Rourke isn't leaving this mountain alive. He thinks he's hunting a witness. He don't know he's hunting a thorn." Crack. The sound was distant, like a dry branch snapping. But Silas knew better. It was a gunshot, a signal shot. He moved instantly, blowing out the lantern, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. He moved to the window, peering through a slit in the shutters. Far down the ridge, against the darkening blue of the twilight snow, he saw them. Torches. 6 of them. Moving slowly up the switchback trail. They were leading horses, trudging through the deep drift. "They're here," Silas said, his voice calm and cold. He turned to Maggie. She wiped the tears from her face. The sadness was gone, replaced by the steel of a woman who had survived a blizzard and a murder attempt. "Here?" Silas handed her the sawed-off shotgun. "Kick is a mule, but at close range, you don't need to aim. If they breach the door, you pull both triggers. Understand?" "I understand," she said. Silas picked up his Winchester and the Colt Peacemaker. He shoved a handful of dynamite sticks into his belt. "Go to the cellar trap door," he commanded. "Stay low. I'm going out to welcome them." "You're going out?" Maggie asked, panic rising. "Cabin is a coffin if they surround us," Silas said. "I need to thin the herd before they get to the porch." He opened the back door, the one facing the sheer drop of the cliff, and the wind howled in. "Silas," Maggie called out. He stopped. "Merry Christmas, Uncle," she said. Silas paused, a grim smile hidden in his beard. Merry Christmas, Maggie. Now keep your head down. He slipped out into the night. The wind was picking up again. The snow was swirling. Silas Thorne disappeared into the white. He wasn't the prey anymore. He was the bear. And the wolves had just walked into his den. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The air was so cold, it felt like inhaling shattered glass. Thaddeus Rourke sat atop his black stallion, watching his men fan out in a crescent formation. They were struggling. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and the wind was whipping up a ground blizzard, obscuring everything below knee height in a shifting white mist. "Spread out," Rourke commanded, his voice cutting through the wind. "He's one old man. Flank the cabin. Dutch, take the left. Miller, take the right. Burn it if you have to." Dutch, the scar-faced mercenary, grunted and racked the slide of his shotgun. He began trudging toward the dark tree line on the west side of the cabin. The cabin itself sat dark and silent, like a sleeping beast. Dutch squinted. He thought he saw movement near the woodpile. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. "I got him," Dutch whispered. He raised his shotgun. Click. The sound wasn't a gun. It was the distinct, metallic snap of a bear trap snapping shut. But it wasn't on a leg. Silas had rigged a trip line to the trap, but not to catch a man. The trap was bolted to a pine tree, holding a bundle of 3 dynamite sticks. The snap was the hammer hitting the blasting cap. Dutch had half a second to realize his mistake. Boom! The explosion shattered the night. A geyser of snow, wood splinters, and earth erupted on the west flank. Dutch was thrown backward, landing 10 feet away in a snowdrift, dazed and deafened. The horses reared, screaming in terror. Rourke fought to control his mount, his face twisting in fury. "Hold the line!" Rourke screamed. "He's trying to spook you!" But the ghost of Bitterroot Ridge wasn't done. While the eyes of Rourke's men were fixed on the smoking crater to the west, Silas Thorne rose from the snow on the east. He had buried himself in a drift hours ago, covered in a white sheet, breathing through a hollow reed. He was 10 yards behind the rearguard, a man named Pike. Silas didn't fire. A gunshot would give away his position too clearly. Instead, he moved with the terrifying silence of the grizzly he was named after. He stepped up behind Pike, the snow muffling his boots. He swung the butt of his Winchester in a brutal, calculated arc. It connected with the back of Pike's skull with a sickening crunch. Pike dropped without a sound. Silas dragged the body into the shadows and vanished again into the white swirl. "Pike!" Rourke called out. "Report." Silence. "Pike!" "He's gone, boss," another man yelled, panic edging into his voice. "I was just looking at him, and now he ain't there." "He's in the trees," Rourke yelled. "Fire at will. Light up the tree line." The 4 remaining mercenaries unleashed a hail of lead into the forest. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like strobe lights, revealing brief, terrifying glimpses of the swirling snow. Bark shattered, branches fell, but there was no return fire. Silas was already moving. He was circling back toward the cabin. He knew he couldn't win a long fight out here. He was 50 years old. His joints were aching, and the adrenaline was the only thing keeping the cold from stopping his heart. He had thinned their numbers, but Rourke was smart. Rourke would realize the game. Silas reached the back of the cabin, slipping through the woodshed. He paused, his chest heaving. He checked his ammo. 3 rounds left in the rifle, 6 in the Colt. Suddenly, a bullet punched through the woodshed wall, missing Silas's ear by an inch. Splinters sprayed his face. "I see you, old friend." Rourke's voice boomed from the darkness. Rourke had spotted the fresh tracks leading to the shed. Silas didn't hesitate. He kicked the back door open and dove into the cabin, rolling across the floor just as a volley of gunfire shredded the doorframe. He scrambled to his feet and slammed the heavy oak bar across the door. "Maggie!" he roared. Maggie was crouched by the hearth, the sawed-off shotgun aimed at the front door. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. "Are you hit?" she asked, seeing the blood on his cheek. "Just a scratch," Silas lied. "It was a graze, but it was bleeding freely. I took out 2, maybe 3, but Rourke is done playing. What do we do?" "Now," Silas said, reloading his Winchester with trembling fingers, "we pray the walls are thick enough." Outside, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then Rourke's voice drifted through the cracks in the logs. It was calm, conversational, and chilling. "Silas," Rourke called out, "you've had your fun, but it's cold out here, and I have a bottle of kerosene." Silas exchanged a look with Maggie. They both knew what that meant. "Send the girl out with the book," Rourke said. "And I'll let you die quick, Silas. A bullet to the head. No pain. You keep the girl, and I burn you both alive. It's Christmas, Silas. Don't make me roast a hog." Silas looked at Maggie. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve. She shook her head slowly. "I'm not going out there," she whispered. Silas turned to the door. "Go to hell, Rourke. The only thing you're getting is lead." "Have it your way." Rourke sighed. A moment later, a heavy object smashed through the front window. It was a glass jug, trailing a burning rag. It shattered on the floorboards. Kerosene splashed everywhere. The rag hit the puddle. Whoosh! A wall of orange flame erupted in the center of the cabin, separating Silas and Maggie. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. The siege was over. The breach had begun. The fire climbed the curtains like a living thing. Smoke, black and oily, began to pool against the ceiling, choking out the air. "The window!" Silas coughed, waving his arm through the smoke. "Get to the back window." "I can't," Maggie screamed. The fire had cut off the path to the bedroom. She was trapped in the corner near the hearth. Silas was on the other side, near the door. The front door groaned. A heavy boot kicked it, then another. The wood splintered around the lock. Rourke's men were using a battering ram, a log from the woodpile. Crack. The door flew open, hanging off one hinge. The wind rushed in, feeding the fire, turning the cabin into a furnace. Through the flames and smoke, figures emerged. 2 men rushed in, scarves over their faces. Silas raised his Winchester. Bang. One man dropped, clutching his stomach. The second man fired wildly. The bullet caught Silas in the left shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the floor hard, the rifle sliding out of reach. The man raised his pistol to finish Silas, but a roar erupted from the corner. Boom! Maggie had fired the sawed-off shotgun. At this range, the spread was devastating. The mercenary was lifted off his feet and thrown back out onto the porch, but the recoil knocked Maggie backward, and she hit her head against the stone hearth. She slumped over, dazed, the gun falling from her hands. Then, the boots walked in. Thaddeus Rourke stepped over the body of his fallen man. He walked through the smoke as if it were a morning mist. He held a long-barreled Schofield revolver in one hand and a handkerchief over his mouth with the other. He looked at Silas, who was struggling to push himself up, blood pouring from his shoulder. He looked at Maggie, semi-conscious in the corner. Rourke smiled behind the handkerchief. He walked over to where Maggie lay and kicked the shotgun away. He reached down and picked up the leather ledger that had fallen beside her. "All this," Rourke said, flipping the book open, "for some ink on paper." He tossed the book into the fire. "No," Silas rasped, trying to crawl forward. "It's done, Silas," Rourke said. He turned and aimed the revolver at Silas's head. "The senator will sleep soundly tonight. And you can finally go see that wife of yours." Silas looked up the barrel of the gun. He was bleeding, beaten, and his home was burning down around him. He looked at Maggie. She was blinking, trying to focus. "I told you," Silas grunted, spitting blood. "She's the miracle." "She's a corpse," Rourke sneered. He pulled the hammer back. But Rourke had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten the very first thing Silas had done when Maggie arrived. Silas had been cleaning his Colt Peacemaker. He had left it on the table. When the table was overturned to barricade the door, the gun had slid underneath it. Silas wasn't crawling away from Rourke. He was crawling toward the overturned table. As Rourke's finger tightened on the trigger, Silas's hand shot out and grabbed the cold steel handle protruding from the debris. It was a move Silas had practiced 1,000 times in his youth. The border roll. Silas rolled onto his back, snapping the gun up. Rourke saw the movement. His eyes widened behind the smoked glasses. He fired. The bullet tore through the floorboards inches from Silas's ear. Silas fired. The shot was deafening in the small space. Rourke stiffened. He took a step back, looking down at his chest. A dark red blossom was spreading rapidly over his heart, staining his expensive duster. He looked at Silas with a look of genuine surprise. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. The revolver slipped from his fingers. Thaddeus Rourke, the wolf of the Copper Kings, fell to his knees, then face forward into the burning debris. "Get up!" Silas roared, the adrenaline spiking one last time. He scrambled over to Maggie. He hauled her up, draping her arm over his good shoulder. The heat was unbearable now. The roof was groaning. "The book!" Maggie cried, looking at the fire. Silas looked. The ledger was in the flames, the edges curling black. "Leave it," Silas yelled. "We have to go." "No." Maggie broke free from him. She lunged into the fire, screaming as the heat seared her hands. She grabbed the burning book and clutched it to her chest, smothering the flames with her sheepskin vest. She fell back, coughing, the book smoking in her arms. Silas grabbed her again, dragging her toward the open door. They stumbled out onto the porch, into the freezing wind, just as the roof of the cabin collapsed inward with a thunderous crash. A plume of sparks shot up into the night sky, mixing with the falling snow. They collapsed in the snowdrift 20 yards away, gasping for air. The heat of the burning cabin kept the freezing cold at bay for a moment. Silas lay on his back, staring up at the sky. The clouds were breaking. A single star shone through. Maggie crawled over to him. She was covered in soot, her hands burned, her face streaked with tears, but she was holding the book. It was singed, the cover warped, but the pages, the truth, were safe. "We did it," she sobbed. "Silas, we did it." Silas didn't answer. His eyes were closed. The blood from his shoulder was staining the snow red, a dark halo around him. "Silas," Maggie shook him. "Uncle Silas." His eyes fluttered open. They were hazy. He looked at her, and for a moment he didn't see the soot or the blood. He just saw his brother's eyes. He saw his daughter. "You got the truth, Maggie?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roaring fire. "I got it," she said. "I have it right here." "Good," Silas breathed. "Then it wasn't for nothing." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Funny," he said. "What? What is it? I wanted to die tonight. Silas smiled faintly. But now, I'm damn afraid to close my eyes. Maggie ripped a strip from her dress and pressed it hard against his wound. Then don't. You hear me, Silas Thorne? You don't. You dare close them. You're the bear. Bears don't die in the winter. They sleep. She looked around desperately. The horses. Rourke's horses were scattered, but one, Rourke's black stallion, stood near the tree line, watching the fire. Stay here, she commanded. She ran to the horse. It shied away, but she grabbed the reins with her burned hands, ignoring the pain. She mounted it and rode it back to Silas. It took every ounce of strength she had to drag the massive mountain man onto the back of the horse. She climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to hold him upright. The cabin was a bonfire now, a beacon visible for miles. Where are we going? Silas mumbled, drifting in and out of consciousness. Iron Creek, Maggie said, kicking the horse into a trot. We're going to the sheriff. And then, we're going to the newspapers. She looked back one last time at the burning pyre on the ridge, the place where Silas Thorne had died a spiritual death 10 years ago, and where he had been reborn tonight in blood and fire. Hang on, Silas, she whispered into the biting wind. The miracle isn't over yet. The descent from Bitterroot Ridge is treacherous in daylight. At night, in a blizzard, carrying a dying man on a stolen stallion, it is a suicide mission. Maggie didn't remember much of the ride. She remembered the horse slipping twice, nearly sending them into the abyss. She remembered Silas's weight growing heavier against her back, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She remembered whispering to him over and over stories about her childhood, about the ocean, anything to keep his mind from drifting into the dark. They arrived in Iron Creek just as the church bell was ringing for morning mass. The sight of them stopped the town dead. A woman with a face black with soot, hair wild and frozen, riding a lathered black stallion, clutching a giant man who looked more dead than alive. Sheriff Josiah Miller was the first to reach them. He pulled Silas off the horse. The bear was unconscious, his coat soaked in blood that had frozen into a stiff, crimson armor. "Doc!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking. "Get Doc Holloway, now!" They laid Silas on the pool table of the very saloon where Rourke had threatened the town hours earlier. The local doctor, a man named Samuel Holloway, who had learned surgery on the battlefields of Shiloh, worked for 6 hours. He extracted the bullet from Silas's shoulder and cauterized the wound with a heated knife. Maggie refused to leave the room. She sat in a chair in the corner, clutching the singed ledger to her chest, watching the rise and fall of Silas's chest. For 3 days, Silas hovered between worlds. The fever took him. He raved about the fire, about Sarah, about the wolves. But on the 4th morning, the fever broke. He opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the sunlight streaming through the window. The second thing he saw was Maggie, asleep in the chair next to him, her hand resting on his arm. He was alive. The fall of the Copper King. While Silas healed, Maggie went to work. She didn't trust the local law with the ledger. Instead, she entrusted the book to a U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves, who was passing through the territory on a warrant. Reeves, a legendary lawman known for his incorruptibility, personally escorted Maggie and the ledger to the federal court in Helena. The contents of the book were explosive. It detailed $50,000 in bribes, over $1.5 million today, 3 ordered assassinations, and the illegal diversion of the river. The trial of Senator Cornelius Vance became the scandal of the decade. The Copper King tried to buy his way out, but the evidence was irrefutable. The testimony of Margaret, the thief Thorne, the widow of his own son, was the nail in the coffin. Vance was stripped of his office and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He died in a cell in 1889. The mining company was dissolved, and the water rights were returned to the reservation, saving countless lives. The quiet years. But the history books often leave out what happened to the heroes. Silas Thorne never went back to the ridge. The cabin was gone, and with it, the ghosts that had haunted him. He didn't rebuild. Instead, he used the reward money, bounty collected on Thaddeus Rourke, who was posthumously identified as a wanted fugitive in 3 states, to buy a small plot of land in the valley near the banks of the river. He didn't live alone. Maggie stayed. She didn't return to Boston. She found she had no taste for high society anymore. She had the mountains in her blood now. She and Silas built a ranch. They raised horses, quarter horses, strong and fast, descended from Rourke's black stallion. It wasn't a fairy tale. Life was hard. The winters were brutal. But the locals noticed a change in the bear. The darkness was gone from his eyes. He was seen laughing in town. He was seen teaching Maggie how to track elk. He was seen at church on Sundays, not praying for forgiveness, but giving thanks. The final entry: Silas Thorne died on October 12th, 1902. He didn't die by the gun or by the cold. He died in his sleep, his heart simply stopping after 68 years of beating against the odds. When they cleared out his desk, Maggie found a new journal. It wasn't a ledger of crimes. It was a diary. The final entry, written just days before he died, read, "I spent 10 years waiting for the end. I thought God had forgotten my address, but he didn't send angels with wings. He sent a girl in rags with a book of sins. They call what happened on the ridge the Christmas miracle. They think the miracle was that we survived the fire. They're wrong. The miracle wasn't that I lived. The miracle was that for the first time since Sarah died, I wanted to." Maggie Thorne lived another 20 years. She never remarried. She became a pillar of the community, a fierce advocate for the miners' widows and the native tribes. If you go to the Iron Creek Cemetery today, past the rusted iron gates, you will find 2 headstones side by side under a massive oak tree. One says, Silas Thorne, 1834-1902. He found peace. The other says, Margaret Thorne, 1859-1922. She brought it to him. And legend says, every Christmas Eve, when the wind howls through the Bitterroot Mountains and the snow buries the world in white, if you listen closely near the ridge of Dead Man's Drop, you don't hear the screams of the dying. You hear the crack of a Winchester and the deep, rumbling laughter of a man who finally won his war. That is the story of the miracle of Bitterroot Ridge. It's a reminder that sometimes the things that save us don't come wrapped in gold or glory. Sometimes they arrive broken, frozen, and terrified on our doorstep. Silas Thorne thought he was saving a stranger that night, but in reality, he was saving himself. It makes you wonder, if you heard a scratch at your door in the middle of a storm, would you be brave enough to open it? Or would you leave the miracle in the snow? This story was pieced together from historical records, court transcripts from the trial of Senator Vance, and the personal journals of the Thorne family. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten history of the Wild West, please do me a favor. click that like button. It helps us keep the campfire burning. Share this video with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe so you don't miss the next legend we dig up from the archives.